When kids don't play, they grow up without imagination. Then it's all small talk and awkward weather chats. Good thing Gushers, Fruit by the Foot, and Fruit Roll-Ups are made to be played with. You better be playing.
The McDonald's Snack Wrap is back. You brought it back. Ranch Snack Wrap. Spicy Snack Wrap. You broke the internet for a snack. Snack Wrap is back. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
The Nordstrom Anniversary Sale is on now. Shop new arrivals on sale for a limited time from Madewell, Bobbi Brown, New Balance, and more. You'll find tons of deals under $100 on summer-ready fits, plus beauty exclusives from your favorite brands. Nordstrom makes shopping easy in stores, at Nordstrom.com, and on their app. Hurry, prices go up August 4th.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
I'm Chris Holmes, and this is Burned by Books. Here you'll find interviews with writers you already love, like Jennifer Egan and Rebecca Makkai, mixed in with up-and-coming voices like Alexandra Kleeman and Rumaan Alam. You'll find us wherever you listen to podcasts, but check out previous episodes at burnedbybooks.com and on Instagram and Twitter at burnedbybooks. Let's start the show. In Amy Reading's marvelous and intrepid biography of Katharine White, The World She Edited, we're welcomed into the fin de siècle moment of the new woman in the United States, an archetype that would suit Katharine White as she rose to become one of the most powerful editors and recruiters for the inquit New Yorker magazine. But Katharine White was remaking that archetype anew, while still being buffeted by sexism and doubts about her own abilities from all sides, domestic and workplace. Through it all, she would revolutionize a magazine that began its life as a humor weekly, but would become, under her tutelage, a landing spot for women writers seeking to carve out space for themselves in the male-dominated work of serious letters. Amy paints an intimate portrait of Katharine's family life and heady days at the indomitable Bryn Mawr College, a proving ground for women intellectuals, especially those who would go on to reshape publishing. And we get the story of two very different marriages, each a powerful shaping agent in Katharine's life. But most profoundly, we see how a small-time city magazine full of gossip whimsy becomes a place for the great voices of American letters in the 20th century, with Katharine editing, encouraging, and providing a proving ground for writers like Mary McCarthy, Elizabeth Bishop, Jean Stafford, and many, many more. Written with a novelist's pacing and attention to character, Amy Reading has written a consuming history of a remarkable woman in remarkable times. Amy Reading is the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment of the Humanities and the New York Public Library. She is the author of The Mark Inside, A Perfect Swindle, A Cunning Revenge, and A Small History of the Big Con. She lives in upstate New York, where she has served on the executive board of Buffalo Street Books, an indie cooperative bookstore, since 2018. Welcome to the show, Amy Reading.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
I am so glad to talk to you. This was a book that just instructed me in so many ways, both about a magazine that I have loved for a very long time and one of its most important founding editors and inventors who I knew literally nothing about and now admire so much. So I'm wondering, how did you come across Katharine White? Did you already know about her? And what was the catalyst for you beginning to research her incredible life?
I didn't know about her until I discovered an essay about her and the writer Jean Stafford in an old literary magazine. And I would be hard-pressed to recreate how I found that essay. But I read it and was incredibly moved by this portrait of two people working together over decades. And it begins in the 1940s when Jean Stafford is recovering from her violent, abusive marriage to the poet Robert Lowell, who was not yet diagnosed with bipolar disorder, but she was She had checked herself into a clinic in New York for what ended up being a year of drying out from alcoholism and recovering from a mental breakdown. And she was just pulling herself back into writing. She had at that point published, I think, just one novel, but she had lost her muse for sure, and was really writing to get back to herself. And she wrote a story based on her breakdown. It's called "The Children Are Bored on Sunday." And she sent it to Katharine White at the New Yorker, and Katharine loved it and published it. And that began this long relationship between the two of them, where Jean Stafford became a short story writer, became known for short stories as her genre. And she published just, story after story, and the two of them worked together very closely. And Katharine went out of her way to pave the way for Jean Stafford to write, even including, and this is my favorite detail, introducing her to A.J. Liebling, a New Yorker reporter who became her third husband. So she was even, a matchmaker. And so when Jean Stafford collected her short stories into a book, she dedicated them to Katharine, and they won the Pulitzer Prize. And so there's this arc from breakdown to absolute, literary success. And Katharine was there all along. And it's very clear when you read the letters between the two of them how the editor-writer relationship worked. That Jean Stafford was writing things that she wouldn't have known to write if there hadn't been this exceptionally responsive woman at the other end of the line. That Katharine called something out from her. And I found that unbelievably moving. I found that I ached for that as a writer, as a
do you think that kind of editor, encourager, shaper, cultivator, is that all but gone now in the super commercialization of publishing?
Well, I can't speak to the whole landscape. I think it's a lot harder because even just in my own publication history, which is, not illustrious at all, but there's much turnover in publishing these days. So even in the publication of this book, I signed a contract for it in 2018. It was published in 2024. And my editor retired, my agent retired, and my publisher was purchased. It was initially Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, published by HarperCollins. So just incredible turnover just in the time it took to write this book. So and that's something that affects editors as well as writers.
Yeah.
And so I do think it's harder, and I do think there isn't really the expectation that you're going to stay with the same person and the same house over the course of your career. But I would also point out that there are big differences between magazine publishing and book publishing, and I don't have a personal experience of magazine publishing. So what Katharine did, I think it does belong to a very specific time in, the arc of the mid 20th century, and to a very specific market for short stories. That is, again, something that I don't have a personal experience of, so I can't speak to the present moment.
This is such a deeply researched biography, down to even descriptions of home movies. I'm very interested in what your major primary sources were and how you went about finding all the material that you used. It felt very sleuth-like when I was reading it.
Oh, thank you. I like that word. Well, but it wasn't sleuth-like because this book had wealth of material. I was drowning in material. I did not have to, put on my magnifying glass and go looking for the details. So the main source, there are two sources, two main archives. One is Katharine's own archive at Bryn Mawr. She, at the end of her life, worked very hard to collect and organize and sort and destroy and save her papers and then donate them to her alma mater. So there are, I want to say, 30 boxes there of her letters, and mainly letters. But then there is a much vaster archive at the New York Public Library, the main branch at 42nd Street in Manhattan, which is the New Yorker papers. They were donated to the New York Public Library and finally made available to researchers in the late 90s. And I can't even describe to you how bottomless this archive is. The best way I can make it real to you is to say that the finding aid for this archive, which is just the printed out list of the boxes in the folders, is 800 pages. Just the list.
Just the list of the boxes.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And of course, it's not like the finding aid says, boxes 1 through 30 are Katharine White's boxes. She's throughout the entire archive. And, the first task that I had was to figure out who who her writers were. Who did she edit? Because there were other editors and they had their stable of writers. And so I had to work very hard to find a map through this vast territory. So
you did do some sleuthing then, because you had to explore a vast wealth.
Yes, I did. It was a great problem to have, because this is the era of typewriters and secretaries and everything in duplicate. And, it was all saved and sorted and organized immaculately. But what I found extraordinary was that I decided my mandate for this book was to read Katharine's editorial memos to her writers, that was the body of work that I would be giving a reading of. So, unlike a literary biography where the body of work is the published, poems or novels or stories, here it was these editorial memos that were behind the scenes that, were not published, that have been hidden from view and were never meant to really be read in this way. But I discovered how incredibly rich and alive these letters were. And it was just riveting. And, to read both halves of all of these correspondences, these people's voices just leap off the page of these letters. So it was very rich.
It is riveting. In fact, I don't think I've ever read editor-author correspondence, maybe with the exception of some of the back and forths with Raymond Carver, but that are like this, just kind of vibrant and alive and just so clear. I mean, you use the phrase going out of her way. This is an editor going out of her way, even when she doesn't like something, which I found incredible, where she thinks it's either not appropriate for the magazine or she thinks it's no good, but she sees some kind of inherent or talent or capability, and she prods, and she's a catalyst, and she brings forth.
Absolutely. I think that was one of the many keys to her editing philosophy. Not that she would have put it this way, but I will, because I'm her biographer.
Yes.
And that she would give these rejections that were very, very detailed and specific, but they were not harsh. They were rejecting the piece, not the writer, and she made that very clear. It was abundantly clear that these writers were continually invited into the magazine. She was not a gatekeeper saying, not good enough, cut this down, try again. It was much more receptive, and in giving a rejection that was specific and giving criticism. And I thought to myself the whole time I was writing this book that, like me, for Katharine White, criticism is her love language. This was how she was showing regard and showing respect. And the criticism was always a way for her to point to what she knew the writer was just about to do, which was the next most perfect story or poem. And that worked. That's how she called out the good work from her writer.
To get a sense of this relationship that Katharine had with her writers, I'm wondering if you'd read from the prologue, which is dated February 1953, and give us a sense of what Katharine was doing to enact real change in the literary world for women.
Here you go. On a February day in 1953, Katharine Sergeant White sat in her corner office at the New Yorker on the 19th floor at 25 West 45th Street. Snow was falling outside, and her desk was piled with manuscripts and mail, all overdue because she'd only just returned to the city from a week at her farmhouse in Maine. One letter solicited her attention above all else, a writer's cry of distress. The short story writer Frances Gray Patton, typing from her home in Durham, North Carolina, confessed to Katharine that she was creatively paralyzed and suffering, quote, guilt and shame over not being able to write. Her mind's like a broken phone. You know how sometimes when you've only half through calling your number, something in the instrument clicks back to that empty, buzzing dial tone? Well, that was what would happen to me when I was halfway through a story. She further confessed that she had been on the verge of asking Katharine for help several times before, but she hadn't wanted to bother her. So instead, she forced herself to write a story, rather dull and contrived, which she was sure Katharine wouldn't like and which hadn't yet worked to lift her out of her doldrums. Katharine's reply twice the length of Patton's letter, scrawled in her clear, definite handwriting in pencil on unlined paper, gorgeously and robustly responded to her author. "I recognize you," she began, "and I know your distress is real. All I can say to reassure you is that I know, I really know, that this sort of trouble happens to every good writer at intervals." She would know, as an editor going on her 18th year at the New Yorker, and the wife of one of the country's most celebrated writers, E.B. White, who was just then enjoying the runaway success of his children's novel, Charlotte's Web, only 4 months old. But Katharine's husband, known as Andy, had a troubled relationship to his own craft, and Katharine often used his travails as an example for her authors. She described to Patton Andy's, quote, "one horrible year" of not writing in the 1930s, and then mentioned several other briefer and more recent dry spells. In fact, she said, just about every fiction writer she knew suffered from Patton's doldrums. They start stories and never finish them, or they finish them and decide they are unsuccessful, or they like them and send them out. These are distinguished writers whose names you would well know, and then get rejections. These episodes happened with such frequency that Katharine had realized they were not symptoms of brokenness, but the very opposite. "Fanny, I'm sure that what you are suffering from is merely the disease of being creative, plus the trouble of having the written word as your medium." Then Katharine dug into some potential solutions. Might Patton take a short trip to write elsewhere, or might she do a different kind of writing, perhaps switching from third to first person, or from fiction to memoir, or casuals and reminiscences in New Yorker parlance? Perhaps she could write under a pseudonym. Katharine even generated a few concrete story ideas from the funny, newsy, personal letters that Patton had recently written to her. She ended the letter squarely on a rejection. The story that Patton thought she wouldn't like had, in fact, been met with a resounding no vote among the magazine's editors. "At the same time, I think you were right to submit this manuscript. A writer half the time can't judge his own work fairly, especially when in a self-doubting mood, so it is better to send out manuscripts than to mull over them." In a letter bursting with generous and buoying sentiments, Katharine was saying, "I could help you read your own work. I'm right there inside it with you." Then she edited her own prose, crossing out words and sentences, adding new ones in the margins, before handing it to her secretary to be typed in duplicate, one copy mailed to Durham, and the other filed in the New Yorker's patent folder for 1953. Good editing is invisible, but masterful editing makes visible the unsaid, because a great editor receives what is not on the page: the unrealized, the unthought, the assumed, the retracted, the tentative, the implied. Once in a while, the art of editing consists of reading not words, but their author, of stepping into the private compositional process to help build the architecture of the writer's inner life. This kind of editing can be intensely personal, and this is the kind of editing that Katharine S. White perfected. Katharine's relationship with Patton typified the method she had refined with dozens of other women writers by this moment in the 1950s, the high point of her editing career. Fanny Patton was herself a late-blooming author. She was the daughter of 2 writers and had studied playwriting at the University of North Carolina, but then she married a Duke University literature professor and focused on raising their son and twin daughters. Only when her daughters were nearing their high school graduation did Patton turn to short stories, publishing her first one in the Kenyon Review in 1945 and winning a spot in that year's O. Henry Memorial Award Prize Stories collection. Katharine bought a story from her the next year and began a warm correspondence. Patton traveled north to New York, and she was so intimidated and keyed up by the city that when Katharine invited her to, quote, "a little family dinner," just the Whites and Harold Ross, the founder of the New Yorker, Patton's, quote, "bones turned to water." But the evening of such august company was, quote, "easy and charming," and Patton comported herself well even when S.J. Perlman sat down for some light banter. By that point, Patton had published 4 stories with Katharine, and 3 more were in the pipeline. She had also earned a bristling sheaf of Katharine's famous rejection letters, scrupulous and detailed explanations for why a given story would not work for the magazine. Katharine frequently found Patton's stories too, quote, "artificial," or overdrawn, or unconvincing. Patton introduced Katharine to her friend and fellow Southerner Peter Taylor, who contributed to The New Yorker for the next 3 decades, Katharine in turn introduced Patton to her dear friend and short story virtuoso, Jean Stafford. Now, in the winter of 1953, Patton's gratitude burst out of her to fill 2 letters. "You have given me back my confidence," she wrote, first by the very fact of her long and engaged letter, but also by conveying that Patton had risked nothing by writing a poor story or confessing her trouble. Quote, "It was almost as if you had assured me of my inalienable right to fail if I had to." And this, Patton had suddenly realized, was a necessary precondition for writing herself out of her paralysis, this, quote, "prevailing mood of quiet optimism that came from not having to pull myself up taller than I really am all the time, from being able to share her flawed work with a responsive editor to whom she was equal." What Katharine elegantly communicated was that their relationship and Patton's position within The New Yorker was secure, so that she need not endlessly audition to be read seriously.
Shh. Hear that? Big waves are calling. Dive into refreshment with Kona Big Wave. Tropical flavor and the taste of aloha in every drop. This summer, don't just listen. Join Kona on the Big Wave Bonfire Tour. More information at konabigwave.com/bigwavemusic. Kona Big Wave. Liquid aloha. Copyright 2025 Kona Brewing Co., St. Louis, Missouri. Mahalo for enjoying responsibly.
When you wanna grow your list size, pop up like it's hot, pop up like it's hot, pop up like it's hot. And when you gotta boost your revenue, pop up like it's hot, hey, pop up like it's hot, pop up like it's hot. Pick your favorite template, you can tailor to your brand. They're MailChimp-erific, you're gonna be a fan. MailChimp your marketing with our new customizable pop-ups.
Thank you so much, Amy. I when I read the prologue, I just knew how much I was going to love this book because I immediately loved Katharine so much. I felt like she was the best kind of professor without having that job. And especially that idea of making space for someone to fail in what seems like such a high wire act, publishing in the New Yorker. But knowing that, an author didn't feel a need to audition constantly and could share things that they were uncertain about or maybe even knew were failed, and that Katharine wouldn't shut the proverbial door in their face. And I wonder, was that why you fell in love with Katharine?
Oh, yes. Yes. She made a home for these women at the New Yorker. She made it a safe place for women who, most of these women were not professional writers when they started out. They were homemakers. Maybe they were writing teachers, or, this was not a solid career path that they were walking through and just, hitting all of their marks. They had to invent it along with her. And that level of encouragement, both emotional and institutional, putting real structures in place for writing and continuing to write, I found very, very moving. And she did this, the other reason why I fell in love with her was because in order to be a responsive editor, she gave herself to these writers in these letters. When I said her voice really comes alive in these letters, it's because she's telling them about her own life and her relating to them.
Andy's struggles too.
And Andy, yes, he figures in her letters quite a lot. And then, when they eventually moved to the very famous farmhouse in Maine where he, set Charlotte's Web, she would give them tales of farmhouse life and, little amusing anecdotes. And so you can, or I could, plot her movements week to week, almost day to day through these letters, because she's telling her authors about her own life and then getting their lives back in this absolute reciprocity. And it was fascinating, but it was also a tool, a kind of a way of relating that was generative for her writers.
Even though this is very much Katharine's story, it's also the story of the birth of the modern woman in the early 20th century, the new archetype for a woman with goals and motivations that reached beyond the domestic. everything from going to college to even riding a bicycle, hopefully without being harassed too much. Can you talk about how the microbiography and the macro story of the modern woman sync up here?
Oh, I love that question. Thank you. They sync up remarkably well. I mean, Katharine was born into the perfect moment for the life she was going to lead. If she had been born a little bit earlier or a little bit later, she couldn't have had this career and this blend of work and family life. So she was born in 1892. She was born to a liberal father. Her mother died when she was 6, so she was raised by her father and his sister, who she called Aunt Crowley. And Aunt Crowley had graduated. She was one of the first generation of women to graduate from Smith College, from a women's college. So Katharine was born into a family that valued women's education. She was the youngest of 3 sisters. Her oldest sister, Elizabeth Shepley Sergeant, who went by Elsie, preceded her to Bryn Mawr and really paved the way for Katharine to have a life of the mind, because Elsie did it first, and she went on to become a reporter, a journalist, and a writer as well. So Katharine went to Bryn Mawr in 1910 and graduated in 1914. And this was a very culturally loaded moment. You know, with hindsight, we can see it was before suffrage, and it was really the height of this first wave of feminism. And Bryn Mawr was run at the time by this very impressive president named Martha Carey Thomas, who would give speeches to her students every day for 10 minutes in the chapel, these chapel speeches where she would, tune their minds to this higher frequency of ambition and responsibility upon graduation, to having a public role as leaders, as educated women. And so one of the famous sayings that Martha Carey Thomas had that made a huge impression on students at this time was, "Our failures only marry." And she meant, if all you do with a Bryn Mawr diploma is marry, you are a failure. That it is your job, your responsibility to contribute to public life, to have a career or a vocation or an art form, to do something outside of the home. So Katharine,
and that was so early because it was through the 1950s and 60s that you had the idea of the MRS degree.
That's right. And so when I say, Katharine couldn't have had this career if she had been born a few years later, this belief that women should contribute to society, that was very, very strong in the progressive era, when women were making huge strides in combating sort of the ills of industrial capitalism and combating their own oppression in the form of campaigning for suffrage. That slid backward very quickly upon passage of the 19th Amendment. And the sort of tentpole issue of feminism was resolved, but then feminism fractured. And there was a series of events over the next decades that made it harder for women to go to college. It made it less likely that they would graduate with a degree that would set them up for a career. But Katharine sort of squeezed through this window where that was possible. And so she represents, to me, to speak to your question of how the sort of the private and the public sync up, she represents a bit of a unexamined generation of women who worked continuously in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s. She was a bridge from the 19-teens and this fervent feminism to the 1960s, when, we have the feminine mystique. And that's at the very end of Katharine's career. That's right after she retires. So she was working continuously at a time when that was not the dominant story, when women weren't in the workforce, when women were getting the MRS degree in order to find a husband and then marry and raise children in the home and not have a career. She was an outlier in that time. And I think it's worth paying attention to the women who got to be the outliers, white privileged women like she was, other women who were in the workforce because they had to be, not because they chose. So there is another story there that she was attuned to as a working woman, editing women who were, by virtue of being writers, also working women. And she absolutely edited the magazine to her cohort, to people just like her, who were educated women, mostly urban women who were paying attention to the events of the day, who were engaged with public life, and who were interested in making contributions in the way that they could and in having careers. And so in that sense, her sort of slipping through this window of time when it was possible to have a family life and a career enormously impacted the New Yorker because of the stories and the writers she edited and brought into the magazine, and because of the readers she assumed she was editing toward.
I want to rest for a second with Bryn Mawr College. I grew up in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, a stone's throw and from the college, and I did not understand what it was in terms of its place within this moment for the modern woman, nor did I understand how bloody hard it was to get in. It had admission standards that I feel like would be almost unmatched anywhere. Nor did I understand that it really was trying to set itself on a par with Harvard, Cambridge, and Oxford. Can you talk a little bit about how challenging it was to gain admissions and what it would mean to the students who graduated from Bryn Mawr?
Yes, I certainly wouldn't be able to gain admission to Bryn Mawr right now.
Yeah, definitely not me. The algebra exam would take me.
As it did Katharine. She and her older sisters went to Miss Windsor's school in Boston, private school for girls. And there, you had two tracks. I can't remember. It was Bryn Mawr and was it Smith's? You had two decisions. Which of the two women's colleges were you going to go to? And the private school taught to the admissions tests of these colleges. There were, I want to say, 15 different tests that you had to take and pass in different subjects, including Latin and Greek and math and science. And they were very, very difficult. And it was absolutely about proving that women could educate their minds on a level with men and not suffer ill consequences from it. And there was a story that was told beginning in the late 19th century and into the 20th, that if a woman were to, distort her mind with education, it would have negative effects on her body, on her physical health, and it would unfit her for her real purpose in life, which was reproduction.
I mean, the uterus falls right out as soon as you start studying math seriously. I mean, everyone knows that, Amy.
Everyone knows that, and yet somehow these women, so they had so much writing on their education. It wasn't just about, can I get the grades? Am I gonna graduate? It was, am I gonna uphold my entire gender? Or am I going to fail my gender?
No pressure.
And this is what President Thomas was lecturing about in the chapel every day. She was laying on the pressure to these girls that you must work hard because people are watching. And this very much affected Katharine's understanding of the relationship between the mind and the body, something that became very crucial to her life when she married her second husband, E.B. White, and he had a difficult relationship to his craft. He was not the easiest of writers. It was not easy for him to put words on the page, and it affected his mental health in a way. And she also, as we saw with Jean Stafford, and even just the passage I read with Frances Gray Patton, many of her authors would come to her with problems, the mental health aspect of trying to create day after day. And she had an understanding of that arose from the education that she had at Bryn Mawr. It was absolutely a through line that it's difficult and you might suffer from it, but that you will be fine. You will survive. Your uterus actually won't fall out. and you can keep at it, and it will get better. And what you write will not show the signs of the struggle that you went through to write it. The struggle will not appear on the page, as it didn't for E.B. White. His prose is so graceful. And so that was very much formed in the crucible of Bryn Mawr as this place where you had to excel no matter what. And even if it was difficult, you had to keep going.
I've had a love affair with the New Yorker since my AP English teacher gifted me a subscription for my graduation. I could barely understand it at the time, but I carried it around like a totem, imagining that it was making me smarter by osmosis. But the world she edited introduces us to the beginnings of the New Yorker under Harold Ross, when it was a humor weekly of quite low stakes, if very fine writing. That was where Katharine cut her teeth as an editor and thinker, but it was really nothing like we think of today as the New Yorker. Tell us a bit about those early days, and then we can discuss how Katharine became an instrument of extraordinary change.
Well, first of all, let me say I love your origin story. How wonderful of your teachers to give you a subscription.
It was a special thing.
And what I've found in talking about this book is that lots of people have origin stories with the New Yorker. They have an emotional connection to this magazine, and they'll be able to tell you when they first encountered it and what it meant to them in a way that, is not true of other magazines.
Mm-hmm.
So that really is extraordinary. But as you say, it was not that way in the early days. So Harold Ross began the New Yorker in 1925 in February. Katharine wasn't hired until August. And in that short interval of time, just a few months, the New Yorker very nearly collapsed and went under because it was not a success. It was just hemorrhaging money. This idea that Harold Ross had was a weekly humor magazine that would focus solely on New York. And if you did that, your ads could focus solely on New York. And you would have this sort of built-in urban audience of people that are going to see these ads, and then they're going to go to the stores and purchase the products that are advertised. So there will be this symbiosis between the readers and the world that it is presenting in the pages of the magazine. But he overestimated how frequently his friends, he was a part of the Algonquin Round Table, this famous circle of wit. He overestimated how often they were going to contribute to the magazine, and it just didn't get off the ground. It wasn't anything extraordinary right away, and advertisers were not buying pages of the magazine. So when Katharine walked into the office and asked for a job in August of 1925, Harold Ross, had no money and no business giving her a job, but he did because he needed someone who was going to do a better job than was currently being done at finding the pieces to enliven the magazine, to attract advertisers to its pages. And he just kind of on a gut instinct knew that would be Katharine. He was very impressed by her education, what he thought was her patrician manner, that she was high class in a way that he was not. And so that is the dynamic that the two of them had, that he was going to lean on her for her judgments because he very much trusted that she was just more knowing in this area of culture than he was. But they still had no money. And so Katharine's job right away was to sift through the slush pile, to sift through all the manuscripts that had been submitted by, complete strangers all around the country. They couldn't afford to go to well-known writers and buy pieces from them. So, very famously, F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway were not in the pages of the New Yorker. They were far too expensive. Edna St. Vincent Millay, the people that should have been there in those early days were not. So instead, it was Katharine opening up envelope after envelope, finding these rare gems among these unknown writers, and then working with them over a series of letters. I mean, I could testify she would be maintaining dozens and dozens of conversations at the same time over days and weeks and months with these authors to get these pieces into the magazine that they could afford. And it worked. They, very gradually, but I will say the magazine was very different decade to decade. So the New Yorker in the 1920s was different from the 1930s. And then again, it really changed sort of slowly. And it's kind of a remarkable thing because if you were to go online, the New Yorker's archives are completely digitized. You can see, if you have a subscription, you can see every issue of the magazine. And even that first issue looks like the New Yorker and sounds like the New Yorker. It's got goings on, talk of the town, on and off the avenue, like the departments that we're so familiar with today. The typeface is unchanged. The voice of it is just so recognizable. And yet it was so different decade to decade. And that's the story that I tell in the biography of Katharine responding to the different changing market for this magazine and for what their conception of what it could be, how it evolved over time.
How do you top your love for your cat? With a cascade of decadent savory gravy over a mouth-watering mousse pâté. Fancy Feast Gems. 2 gourmet pâtés in one convenient pack. Simply peel and plate to reveal a pyramid shape that makes eating delightful and pamper her with an experience as extraordinary as she is. Turn the everyday into the extraordinary with Fancy Feast Gems.
This episode is sponsored by Friskies, who would like to tell your cats hi. Now, if that didn't get your cat's attention, there is one thing that always does the trick. Just pour some Friskies crunchy food in the bowl and you'll hear those paws come running. Works every time. With so many Friskies choices, you can always bring your cats running from their secret napping spots. There's always more to explore. See for yourself at friskies.com or visit your local store.
At one point, you described Katharine's discovery of 4 unknown female poets in 1926, but you also say that with her discoveries came a move away from very light and often humorous poetry to darker verses, quote, attuned to the discourse of urban single life. How did those two things come together under Katharine's leadership on the literary side of the New Yorker?
My theory is that she was editing for herself. She was acquiring in this case, the poems that she herself wanted to read. And in the 1920s, she was very unhappily married to her first husband, Ernest Angell, someone that she met in New Hampshire in the summers when her family summered in the same place as his family. He was from Cleveland, Ohio. And she actually began her college career in 1910, already engaged to be married to him. He was much older. He went to Harvard and then graduated from Harvard Law. And so they were married very young. And by the 1920s, their marriage had soured. And so she was disillusioned. She was disillusioned about
soured because of his philandering and impregnating his mistress.
Yeah, a big one. That's kind of a deal breaker. So the story is that he had served in World War I in France and rather liked the French way of having a wife and a mistress, and he had affairs while he was abroad and then came home and continued to have affairs and eventually wanted Katharine to have an open marriage. And she was not interested in that unconventional lifestyle at all. It actually wasn't quite as unconventional among their circle at that time. It was, sort of a trendy way to think about marriage. Marriage was changing a lot over the 1920s, both in terms of how you define marriage and how you define divorce. But she still wanted a conventional marriage. She did not want to have affairs. She definitely did not want him to have affairs. And she stuck it out as long as she could. They had 2 children, and she had, part of why, just to back up for a second, part of why she went to the New Yorker and knocked on the door and asked for a job in 1925 was because she was so unhappy at home. And she was looking for something that would fulfill her aside from being this unhappy wife and sort of stuck in the house mother. And that was the New Yorker. And another source of tension in her marriage was that Ernest did not love her job and her earning potential, which was greater than his at that point, and was sort of jealous of her job and jealous of her life outside of the home. So all of these things made their way into her editing. This shaped her worldview. This shaped her desires for what she wanted to read and for how she understood women just like her cohort that had been educated in the teens and were raising families in the 20s and having a hard time of it. And so I think there's a pretty one-to-one relationship between her personal experience and what made it into the pages of the magazine.
One of the things that's this sort of incredible friction within Katharine herself is that she's both part of this vanguard of women in publishing, of newly educated and powerfully intellectual in a world once dominated by men, But she's also very much someone who had to struggle against sexism and misogyny that really undergirded her work life and her domestic life. You seem to want to capture both her endless energy for lifting up other women while handling with care her own great self-doubt as a writer and as a professional, and the trials of a society that wasn't ready for a truly new woman. Can you talk about that friction?
Yeah, the way that I would talk about it are in terms that Katharine never would have used. I don't think she would ever have said that she experienced misogyny, but it's very clear to me. I've read the memos. I know she did. She was an interesting combination of forceful and powerful and confident. I mean, the confidence with which she invented her job at the New Yorker and just, sort of created this way of editing and created this worldview through what she edited blows me away. But at the same time, she absolutely deferred to Harold Ross as the father of the New Yorker, the parental figure, the man, the patriarch.
Who was openly sexist, although he said he considered Katharine a man. So that allowed her to sort of kind of fall outside of his treatment of, what did he say, women, children, and the ministers, I think, were fall into one group for him.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why Katharine got to be the exception, but she was always the only woman in the room. And he would curse in front of her, whereas he wouldn't curse in front of other women. Like, he would treat her as one of the men. But that, that was problematic at the time. And she would never have seen it that way. But what she did, she spent a lifetime deferring to him, and also deferring once she married E.B. White in 1929, deferring to his career once his career was launched and he became this beloved writer. That was always more important to her than her own job. She was just an editor, whereas he was this writer, a figure that she exalted because, writers did the real work. That was the premise of her very job. So she had both a kind of confidence and doubt, but she would not have put it in those terms because she, as I said, she retired before second wave feminism really got up and running in the early 60s. She did not have words to describe that dynamic, that interplay between the power that she had, but also the continual sort of the backhanded insults that made her often unliked for holding that power, and that she had to continually navigate within the office.
Amy, before I let you go, I would love to know a little bit about what you're reading and loving recently. I think my listeners would be very hungry for your recommendations.
Well, I thought long and hard about this question because it's such a pleasure to recommend books. And I wanted to recommend some nonfiction books because I know you mostly have novelists on the show. So I have 3 books, but the first one actually is a novel, The Biography of X by Catherine Lacey. This is a novel that I found unputdownable, just absolutely riveting. It combines 2 things that I love, a biography with the whole sweep of a life from birth to death, but also within the pages of it, the getting of the biography, the story of the writer, or in this case, the narrator's research and inquiry, kind of like a detective story, like you said, sleuthing for the story. So it's about a character named X who was enigmatic, shape-shifting downtown artist in the 1970s and 80s, and she dies in 1996, after which her wife decides to find out who X really was to pull off all her many masks. So that's the story of the continually unmasking this woman that she thought she knew. And it's set in this absolutely bonkers alternative America after what is called the Great Disunion of 1945, in which the country was split north to south and separated by this wall. And the South becomes like North Korea, just completely isolated. I love this book.
Gosh.
So much. This book
sounds
so much
tricky.
energy. But it's riveting. Talk about a page turner. And to me, what makes the book good is that it releases so much energy by crashing fiction and biography together. And so that is obviously catnip for me.
Mm-hmm.
So next I have.
Did Catherine Lacey also write Pew?
Yes, she did. That's her, I think her previous novel. Yes.
I loved that novel. It was recommended by one of my guests, and I read it, and I thought it was amazing.
Yes, she has quite a few other novels, but this one, start here. It's so good. Okay, so next I have 2 nonfiction books. The first one is called The Movement: How Women's Liberation Transformed America 1963 to 1973 by Clara Bingham. And this is an oral history by dozens of the women who were there at the creation of second wave feminism. And reading it, it feels like feminism is coming into being right in front of your eyes. It is so vivid and it's suspenseful, even though you know how it turns out. And honestly, I think every feminist should read this book. And I promise you that there are events and people in here that you've never heard of. Certainly there were, and I thought I was fairly well read. So I couldn't recommend this highly enough, especially if you need a little bit of reinvigoration after Dobb.
Oh, God. Yeah, I don't know anyone who doesn't. So,
And then my last book is The Equivalents, a story of art, female friendship, and liberation in the 1960s by Maggie Doherty. This is about something I had never heard of, the Radcliffe Institute for Independent Study, which was created in 1960 to give fellowships and on-campus offices to women who were, quote, intellectually displaced women, or women with advanced degrees or advanced art practices whose careers hadn't really taken off because they'd been sidetracked by kids and family and just plain old misogyny. So they were given a stipend and time to create. And also they were given each other this fellowship, this network of other very, very accomplished women who were all sort of doing the same or at the same moment in their careers. And Doherty follows 5 of the fellows, the poets Anne Saxton and Maxine Kumin, writer Tilly Olson, sculptor Mariana Pineda, and painter Barbara Swan. And this, I found this so moving in the same way that I found Katharine's editorial letters to her women writers moving. These women pursuing their vocations together in this protected environment that dismantled many of the obstacles they faced in their work. So I highly recommend that as well.
I have read Maggie Doherty or Doherty's magazine writing and think she's a brilliant writer. So
she's a New Yorker writer.
Yeah, she is. And so I will absolutely seek that out. It sounds incredible. I'm not familiar with any of these, which I love because it adds to my TBR list. And I know that the listeners will be excited for this and for nonfiction, which I think they hunger for and I do not always serve up. But it's most important to me that they go and seek out this just absolutely marvelous, page-turning, in-depth biography of a woman who absolutely transformed and transfigured the landscape for women writers, and particularly at the birth of the New Yorker, the world she edited. Katharine S. White at the New Yorker by Amy Reading. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about this marvelous book.
What an absolute pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Well, that's all from me for now. My thanks to the brilliant Amy Reading for coming on to talk about The World She Edited, her biography of the pioneering New Yorker editor Katharine White. You can find links to purchase The World She Edited and all of Amy's recommended books at the website, burnedbybooks.com. There you'll find all of our previous episodes, links to buy a podcast t-shirt, and ways to get in contact. As you listen, take a moment to rate the show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, this has been Burned by Books.